There have been multiple times in my life where I have had a bad conversation with someone, whether it was because of my listening skills, nonverbal cues, or my perception of their message. Somehow it went wrong. Communication is a tricky thing, especially in today's society. Perception is one thing that causes people to have such horrible interactions. Also, nonverbal communication is very tricky and can cause people to lose trust in the message sender. Lastly, people have stopped listening to one another. Instead of taking the time to have a pleasant conversation, they try to multitask and stop listening. Competent communication requires many skills, but if made aware of them, everyone can become a competent communicator. Perception is one thing that has a big impact on communication. Sealer et al. Says, perception involves selecting, organizing, and interpreting information to give meaning to our communication and lives. People interpret things to become more familiar with their surroundings. Billmore on page 10 says, our five senses help us perceive the different people, places, objects, and events that are present in our lives. Perception changes our communication. Bellmore on page 10 says, we can't take in a lot of information at once, so we use selective perception. One thing about selective perception is selective attention. This is when we choose what we focus on. It's usually something that we are interested in or that we need. Selective exposure is when we choose what we're exposed to, and it's usually something that is based on our beliefs or something that we have previous knowledge of. Another thing that affects our communication is listening. It's important to understand the difference between listening and hearing. Sealer et al. Defines listening as a cognitive activity that is defined as the active process of receiving, constructing meaning from, and responding to spoken or nonverbal messages. Whereas hearing is just a passive process where our ears take in sound and our brain does not comprehend what we are hearing. There are also different kinds of listening, and it's important to know which one to use when listening to others. Listening for information, according to Sealer et al., is listening to gain comprehension. An example of listening for information is listening to a lecture. Another type of listening is empathetic listening. Sealer et al. Defines this as listening to understand what another person is thinking or feeling. An example of this is when a friend is telling you about their day and you're listening to try to understand their feelings and reciprocate. Lastly, there's evaluative listening. Sealer et al. Defines this as listening to judge or analyze information. An example of this is a jury at a court case. They are trying to find out the truth and get to the bottom of who's guilty and who's not. Lastly, nonverbal communication makes us competent communicators if we can recognize and use it effectively. Nonverbal communication is any type of communication that is without words. Sealer et al. Says nonverbal communication consists of kinesics, physical characteristics, haptics, proxemics, chronemics, vocalics or paralanguage, silence, artifacts, and environment. Siegel et al. Says that our facial expressions give away our feelings and they are used across cultures. We get most of the message that we are receiving from nonverbal communication. Siegel et al. Says that when using nonverbal communication, you tell the person you're communicating with whether or not you care, if you're being truthful, and how well you're listening. They also say that when used incorrectly, both connection and trust in relationship are damaged. Sealer et al. Says that nonverbal communication can complement, repeat, regulate, substitute, or deceive a message. To sum up, there are so many ways to mess up a conversation. However, if taught about how to avoid an incompetent communication, people can become more competent communicators. Focusing on perceiving a message correctly can help avoid a misunderstanding. Also, if people take a minute to stop and listen to a person, they can have a much better conversation. Lastly, focusing on using nonverbal communication to add to a conversation in a great way to make an interaction more lively. If people know the skills they need to communicate confidently, it will become so much easier to have a pleasant conversation.